Jordan, how did the Soviet Union enter World War II? We will still be talking about that because we're going to talk about...
Because Russia attacked them.
Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind. Taisha, leaders were of the Soviet Union. Who were the leaders of the Soviet Union, Italy, and Germany? We're going to talk about that too. And then Amber, how did the U.S. enter World War II, and why not earlier? Okay, so these are things we're going to answer questions to. We'll take it one step at a time. But before that, I want to go and I'm going to give you a PowerPoint. Okay, now this is a fun picture, and it doesn't really give you a lot of information, but I'll explain it using my own picture. Okay. So, for whatever reason, and it's just to let you know, it's very weird, but for whatever reason, the last couple of years, we actually have people that say they want to be socialists. And so you have heard the term socialist. And this is fairly rare because in the United States it's not very popular for national folks to ever mention socialism because it kind of goes against the whole fabric of American society. So the question is, well, what does it mean? And how is it different from what the United States has? Now typically people will say, well, you have socialism and then you have capitalism. But that's not accurate. Capitalism is kind of a form of our system, but it's not exactly what our system is. Okay? What our system is called is free market. And this is an economic system. And free market is based off of this idea that in the United States, you guys have heard, and I told you over and over again, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, they're endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Have you guys ever figured out what pursuit of happiness means? I mean, doesn't that kind of sound silly? Pursuit of happiness. Now, we understand life, liberty. We can't be killed arbitrarily by the government. We can't be thrown in jail arbitrarily by the government. But what does it mean to have pursuit of happiness? Close. It does. It really does. But it's actually, it's so much more simple than it sounds. The pursuit of happiness. Your own dream. Whatever you want to do. It is a synonym for freedom. Okay? Freedom. Liberty. It's what the mission of our country, the United States, is based on. Now, this is Western Civ, but it's very, very important. Because we talked about why the U.S. did not enter into World War I. And part of this is that this old American idea is very ideological. The United States is very ideological. Remember? Well, it's the opposite of ideological.
It's in my head, but
Starts with a P.
Pragmatic.
Pragmatic. Okay. Pragmatic is basically you do what needs to be done, right? Regardless of wrong or right. It doesn't have any concept of wrong or right. And the United States has always been concerned about wrong or right. And this is ironic because today, the same people that are kind of talking about socialism are based on this concept of wrong and right. And so both of these concepts are actually ideological in theory. In other words, it sounds ideological. Now, not necessarily in practice. In practice, we're going to talk about this. In practice, socialism is very, very pragmatic. But in theory, it sounds very, very ideological, very idealistic. And that's kind of why sometimes Americans, like today, will bring up this term. Unfortunately, and I have to be brutally honest, and you guys you're aware of this. Unfortunately, because of social media. We have a very wide expanse of people that feel like they're somehow educated because they're talking with people all the time. And yet, they're really grossly ignorant. And I don't mean that as an insult, I mean that as an actual description. You guys understand what ignorant means. It means not knowledge. You don't have the knowledge. You can be a good guy, innocent guy, and ignorant means you just aren't trained in it. And so we have a whole bunch of folks that think that they know, but they don't. And so we start having conversations and discussions, and there's no facts in it. And part of the reason why socialism becomes something that's kind of attractive is that it is ideological, and it actually very strongly reflects this strong American heritage, this identity, the things to do the right thing, right? Equality, liberty, we want everybody to be free. It's connected to this. But the problem is that we don't quite understand what the word actually means. So if I were to say socialism, what does it mean? You guys give me a guess. And I think we talked about this a little bit, so maybe you remember, but maybe not. So we'll start.
Socially active.
That's what some people think, right?
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with that. But it's a very reasonable conclusion, right? Because you're socially active, right? You care. Socialists that care about things. But what would be a technical definition?
Pretty sure we wrote down the definition.
Yeah, well, let me just contrast it. So the free market society is based on the idea that you pursue your own happiness. And so it assumes the role of private property. This sounds silly, but the truth is, go ahead.
Wouldn't it be
Governmental.
like what China was, where they had, like, everything belongs to the government, and then you get
Yes.
certain things distributed to you, and only certain,
Yes.
like, certain people have a certain amount of things.
No private property, government ownership of means of production. And this is a complicated term, but it's actually super easy. Means of production, the things that make things. In plain language, factories, right? The means of production. So the government ownership of the means of production, no private property. And the government owns means of production. The reason why that these are contrary is that the pursuit of happiness assumes that you choose what you want to do as a job. You have the freedom to choose what you want to do as a job. And then they pay you. And there's an assumption that if they pay you, you should be able to keep what you earn. And so then you can accumulate property as a kind of an incentive. In fact, the whole free market concept is based off of these ideas of what we call supply and demand. We've talked about this before. If you have a high supply of something, then the price is not very high. Air, we don't charge for air because it's everywhere, right? Water, for the most part. If you have a low supply, very minimal, like gold or diamonds, then their value is super high. Similarly, demand. If you have a high supply, a low supply of something and nobody wants it, like the fungus under your toes might be very minimal. It's only your fungus. It's very rare, right? You can say, hey, rare. Nobody wants it. Low demand. You can't give it away, thankfully. So supply and demand. And this concept of supply and demand means that people will produce basically what they want. If they want something, somebody out there will make it. If they don't want it, then you'll stop making it and you'll make something else. This is sometimes referred to also as the invisible hand. And this term used to be very popularly understood. In other words, most people understood the concept of the invisible hand. You don't have to tell Bob, who wants to sell his toenail clippings for $500, you don't have to tell Bob that no one's going to buy his toenail clippings. Okay? He understands there's no demand for this. No demand. And so I'll go into some other type of business. Maybe I'll make something that's cute that people like. High demand. And since I'm making it and it's just me, it's also kind of rare. Supply is low. That's how I'll make money, right? If I make these, so many of them, that everybody's got one, even though they're cute and people like them, they may get bored with them. And so the supply will be very high, and the demand will start to go down, and so I won't get any money anymore. I'll move into some other business or some other type of activity. It's an invisible hand. They don't have to tell Bob to do this. People aren't buying it, he changes. This is kind of what the free market. Now, free market always presupposes democracy of some sort because it's based off of freedom. In fact, they go hand in hand. You don't need to know this too much because this is mostly what happened before the United States, but we are Western civs, so you do remember way back when we were talking about the Middle Ages, they had some free market, but mostly not. If you remember, in the Middle Ages, people were living in the castles, right? The peasants were there because they needed the protection. There's no money exchanging. There's not a lot of freedom. They're not slaves. They're not slaves. The peasants are there voluntarily. But whatever they make is part of the castle. The guy who's the lord of the castle promises to protect them, but then he also gets whatever is made. And so they don't get paid. But on the other hand, you don't have to pay rent either. It's part of being there. This is the old-fashioned style of the economy. Free market begins to emerge slowly. Remember, it's feudalism, and then the next step is this absolutism, where the king starts saying, I'm going to be the guy who restores order, so all the lords have to give me a little bit of money because we're going to pay for the standing army. The lords then start having to charge their peasants, so not just a portion, but they have to charge the peasants money, and so we shift into this different economy. And it's against this absolutism that we see the rise of constitutionalism. In England was the first one. Why should we give you money if you're not protecting our rights? And so there should be some freedoms. We should be able to be a business. We should be able to buy and sell without having to give the king all of this stuff. And in fact, if the king doesn't protect our rights, what are we going to do? We're going to alter the government. Either kill him like they did with Charles II, or tell, like James II, go away because you are not protecting our rights. That was a glorious revolution. And in the United States, that was 100 years later, we said, this is what we hold our governments to be true. All people are endowed with their great with certain unalienable rights. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Governments cannot take those rights away unless you've forfeited them. If you start murdering other people, you have forfeited your life, right? But if you don't do those things, then these are your natural, inalienable rights. And so because of this, this free market it's tied to democracy. Well, socialism is an ideological idea that argues that there should be no private property. Government should own the means of production. And what that means then is that government regulates most things. Well, little itty-bitty things. So let's say it's in our interest. We don't want to pollute the environment, so we're going to say no straws. It sounds like a silly thing, right? No straws. The government, you might say, well, it's justification because if we have straws, it'll get plastic and we'll fill up the landfills and all sorts of things. So let's all agree no straws. Well, what have you done when you say no straws? You have taken away a freedom, right? The more regulation you have, the less freedom. So if you say no private property, that means then that your goods aren't really yours. It's not based off of the idea that all men are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. It's actually, and you don't want to be concerned about it, but it's more of a Hobbesian idea. And this argument basically supposes that the government owns all rights. And then they give them out as needed. So when you say socialist economy, often we say things, and you guys hear this. This is one of the reasons why the socialist word has popped up. So someone will say, hey, we're going to give you free college. How many of you guys want free college? Absolutely, I want free college, right? Well, what does that actually mean? Is college ever actually free?
Like,
Someone's got to pay me, right?
your tuition would be free, but you'd like pay for like supplies.
No, free college will give you everything. But is it really free?
No, because you're gonna have higher taxes to pay the professors.
There's no such thing as free. Because I have to be paid, the lights have to be paid, electricity has to be paid, all this stuff has to be paid, the new toys have to be paid. So nothing is free. So if we say free college, what are we really saying?
Higher taxes for.
We're saying there's no private property.
And other people will pay for your.
Other people. We call it redistribution of wealth. And redistribution of wealth means that you don't actually have private property. Now this can sound very flowery, especially on social media, but people will actually say this. Well, people have too much money. Those people have too much money. What that means is that you don't actually have a right to that amount of money. Because your rights are given out to the government, and somehow the government allowed that person to have that much money. How is that possible? He shouldn't have that much money. It's based off a presumption that you don't actually have a right to your property. So there are folks that come up, the socialist idea, that come up with an argument that if you make more than $100,000, then every penny more should go to the government. Because then the government will use that to pay for education or whatever. Because you don't have right, and the government then owns this. It's a totally different idea from what the United States is based on. Now, most people don't think about that. They say free government. They think the government has all the money in the world, so free education. Of course I want free education. Free health care. Of course I want free health care. But there's no such thing as something that's free. It means somebody else has to pay for it. Now, there are two different arguments here. But the argument on this side is that this invisible hand, this provides what we call a natural incentive for productivity. What does that mean, productivity? In a plain language, it means there's a natural incentive to work. If someone says, I'm going to give you $100 an hour, you're going to work, get $100 an hour. If someone says, you could possibly get a couple of $100 just for being you, you don't really have to do anything, then what are you going to do? Nothing, right? There's no incentive to work because you can get it for free. So this concept, the reason why people object to this is that there's no incentive for work. There is an incentive, and this is very important. There is a natural incentive for government jobs. Why would that be the case?
Because if you were part of the government, then you're part of what owns it.
The money is going to the government. It's a natural incentive, right? But there's no incentive for work. These are clearly different views. Now, there are folks, and if you look at this, because it is an ideological argument, this is an ideological argument saying, you know what? You shouldn't have to work. You shouldn't have to. You should just be able to just live and just do whatever you want to do. So why do you need to worry about paying for school? Why do you need to be worried about paying for health care? Why do you have to worry about paying for anything? You should just be able to do what you want to do. And that's okay, except then you guys are smart enough to realize that there's no private property, and if there's no incentive to work, then how is the government eventually going to get that money? Because it's got it. You can't not pay for things. And so this is where, as a practical matter, socialist countries tend to be very poor.